My name is Emma Carter. I'm 29, and I've spent the last 6 years pulling strangers back from the edge of death in a Level 1 trauma unit. I know the exact weight of a chest during compressions. I know the sound a monitor makes right before it stops meaning anything. I know how to stay calm when everyone else in the room is losing their mind. None of that prepared me for my father's living room. 3 days before, I'd been the one who found her. Grandma Evelyn had a rule: call before 9 or don't call at all, because a woman her age needed her mornings quiet. But she never missed my Sunday check-in, not once in 6 years, and when the phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail, I already knew. I drove to her house, still in my scrubs, still smelling faintly like the hospital, and I let myself in with the key she'd given me when I was 19. The house had gone still in a way it had never been still before, and I knew it. The second I opened the door, the same way I know a code is coming before the monitor even flatlines. She was in her reading chair by the window, library book open on her lap. Something by Wallace Stegner, page 60-something. A bookmark tucked in the back cover out of pure habit, even though she'd never need it again. Her glasses were still on. It looked for all the world like she'd simply closed her eyes between chapters. I checked for a pulse, the way I've checked for 100 pulses that weren't there. And then I sat down on the floor next to her chair and stayed there for 40 minutes before I could make myself call anyone. Once I made that call, she would be gone in every official, permanent way, and I wasn't ready to let go of the last few minutes where it was still just the two of us. And a house that still smelled like her lavender hand cream and the paperback dust of 10,000 library books. I hadn't told my father any of that. He hadn't asked. In the 3 days since, he'd called me exactly twice, once to ask if I knew the code to her garage door opener, and once to ask whether the house would show better with or without the built-in bookshelves in the den. Not once to ask how I was doing. Not once to ask what it had been like, being the one who found her. The funeral reception was supposed to be the easy part. The burial was over. The flowers were wilting on the folding tables. Someone's aunt had made too much potato salad, and it sat there sweating under the kitchen lights while 40 people, I barely recognized, picked at paper plates and told each other how peaceful. Grandma Evelyn looked in her casket. I hadn't touched my plate. I was still holding the small parcel Olivia Bennett, my grandmother's attorney, had pressed into my hands after the service. A brown paper envelope, soft with age at the corners, the kind that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had gone white. Inside it was a savings passbook. Faded blue cover, First National Trust, the branch that had closed down and reopened under 3 different names. Since I was a kid, I hadn't even opened it yet. I was still trying to breathe. That's when my father found me. Michael Carter has a way of entering a room, like he's already decided how the conversation is going to go. Real estate agents are like that. They walk into a house that isn't theirs and start rearranging the furniture in their heads before they've even taken off their shoes. He did the same thing at his own mother's funeral. He'd been doing it since we got back from the cemetery, drifting from relative to relative, with that same practiced, sympathetic tilt of his head, and I'd watched him ask no fewer than 4 people, the same question dressed up in 4 different ways. Did she say anything to you about the house? About her accounts? About anything? He hadn't asked me. He hadn't needed to. He assumed I already knew, and that I was hiding it. What's that? Not a question. He was already reaching for it. Dad, don't. Emma, what did Olivia give you? I should have walked away. 6 years in an ER teaches you to read a room, and every instinct I had was screaming that this was not the place. That grief makes people do things they can't take back. That I should just put the envelope in my purse and deal with it later, alone, where nobody could watch my face. But he was my father, and it was my grandmother's last gift to me. And some small, stupid, hopeful part of me still wanted to believe that if I just showed him, if I just let him see that Grandma had thought of me, that maybe, for once, he'd be happy for me instead of doing the math on what he'd lost. I handed him the passbook. He opened it, flipped to the last entry. I watched his eyebrows pull together as he read the balance. $142.16. Untouched, since a deposit made sometime in the 90s, the ink so faded, it had gone the color of weak tea. The room had gone quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when people pretend they're not listening, while listening very hard. My stepmother Karen appeared at his elbow like she'd been summoned. Karen manages a boutique on the north side of town, the kind that sells $80 candles to women who complain about the price and buy them anyway. She has never in her life let a silence sit for longer than 3 seconds if she could fill it with something cutting. That's it? Karen's laugh was small and sharp, the kind designed to travel exactly as far as it needed to, and not an inch further. That's what Evelyn left the nurse, $142. The nurse. Not Emma. Not her granddaughter. The nurse. Like my job was a costume I put on. Not 14 years of my life. Not the reason I'd missed 2 Christmases and one of my own birthdays. Not the thing that had let me hold my grandmother's hand and read her vitals in the last hour of her life. And no, professionally and personally, exactly when she stopped being in pain. My father didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. He looked at the passbook one more time, made a small sound in the back of his throat that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a scoff, and then he did something I will remember for the rest of my life, with the same clarity I remember the first time I ever called a time of death. He tossed it, underhand, almost lazy, the way you toss a used napkin toward a trash can. You weren't sure you'd hit. It landed in the wastebasket by the kitchen island, half buried under a crumpled paper towel, already stained with barbecue sauce. That's what 40 years of being nobody gets you, he said to the room more than to me. A bank book nobody's touched since Clinton was president. At least Tyler's getting the truck. Tyler, my stepbrother, had the decency to look uncomfortable. Tyler sells cars for a living and has the emotional range of a showroom brochure, but even he winced. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that, because I know how this sounds, how it's supposed to sound. The humiliated daughter, the tears, the dramatic exit. That's not what happened. What happened is that something in my chest went very, very still, the same stillness I feel in a trauma bay in the half second before I start working, when the panic drains out of me and everything becomes clean and procedural and quiet. I walked to the wastebasket. I picked the passbook back out from under the paper towel. I didn't wipe it off in front of them. I just held it, and I looked at my father, and for the first time in 29 years, I understood something about him with the same clean certainty. I feel reading a monitor. He had never once, not one single time, weighed me against anything, and found me worth more than the number in front of him. Grandma had known that. She'd known it for years. That's why the note tucked inside the passbook's back cover, 3 words in her careful librarian's handwriting. Ask for Rebecca. Wasn't an accident. It was a plan. A plan built for exactly this moment, for exactly this room, for exactly the version of my father who couldn't resist doing arithmetic over a dead woman's kitchen counter before the flowers on her grave had even settled. I put the passbook in my purse. I said nothing. I picked up my coat. If you've ever sat in a room and watched your own family do the math on whether you were worth loving. Number 1 column, disappointment column 2. Drop a comment below. I want to know I'm not the only one. I sat in my car in my father's driveway for a full minute before I could make myself go back inside for my purse, which I'd left on the hallway table, in the chaos of people leaving. Through the front window, I could still see them. Karen laughing at something with her wine glass, tipped at an angle that would have horrified her if she'd seen it in a boutique mirror. Tyler scrolling his phone, with his tie already loosened. My father shaking hands with a second cousin, twice removed, like he was working an open house. 40 minutes ago, they'd all stood at a graveside in matching black and cried on cue. Now the show was over, and everyone was back to being exactly who they actually were. I went back in for my purse, and nobody looked up. I'd grown up being told, gently and then not so gently, that I was the family's cautionary tale. Michael's first wife, my mother, had left when I was 6, and somewhere in the retelling over the years, in Karen's careful additions and my father's convenient omissions, that story had shifted until it wasn't about a marriage that failed. It became about me, about how I took after her, about how nursing was a fine little job but not a real career. Not like Michael's real estate empire of 4 listings and a leased BMW. Not like Tyler's commission checks at the dealership that Michael bragged about at every holiday dinner. Like Tyler had cured a disease instead of upsold an extended warranty. Grandma Evelyn never once let that story stand uncorrected in front of her. She'd been a school librarian for 31 years, the kind of woman who could silence a room of screaming 8th graders with a single raised eyebrow. And she brought that same quiet, immovable authority to every Thanksgiving where Michael tried to make me small. "Emma saves lives for a living," she told him once, not raising her voice, simply stating it the way she'd state a fact about the Dewey Decimal System. "I'd like to see your listings do that." She had a whole arsenal of quiet lines like that, deployed only when necessary, never repeated twice in the same argument, because she considered repetition beneath her. When Karen once suggested at a 4th of July barbecue that I might have more luck finding a husband if I worked fewer nights, Evelyn had simply asked Karen, in front of everyone, how her boutique's quarterly numbers were doing this year, and let the silence that followed do the rest of the work. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. She'd spent 3 decades managing rooms full of teenagers who thought they'd found every loophole in the rulebook, and grown adults, it turned out, were considerably easier to outmaneuver. What I hadn't understood, growing up, was that she wasn't just defending me in the moment. She was building a case. Every slight Michael let slip in front of her, every time Karen called my job a fine little hobby, every Christmas Tyler got a car detail package while I got a card. Evelyn absorbed all of it without comment, filed it away behind those sharp, patient eyes, and said nothing until the moment called for exactly the right 4 words. I used to think it was restraint. Now, walking to my car with a 100-year-old passbook and a 3-word note pressed against my sternum, I was starting to understand it as something closer to strategy. I hadn't understood, until the reception, how carefully she'd been keeping score. Not for spite. Evelyn Carter didn't do spite. She did preparation. She was the kind of woman who renewed her library card 6 months early because she didn't like leaving things to chance, who kept a fire extinguisher in every room of her house, including the one nobody used, who wrote thank you notes the same day a gift arrived because she believed gratitude had a shelf life. If she'd built something, and I was starting to understand, walking to my car with a 100-year-old passbook and a 3-word note pressed against my sternum, that she had built something. She would have built it exactly the way she built everything. Quietly, years in advance, with every contingency accounted for, including the contingency of her own son, laughing at what looked like nothing at all. My hands weren't shaking when I got in the car. That surprised me more than anything that had happened inside. In the ER, I've learned to notice my own body the way I'd notice a patient's. The hands are usually the first to go. First sign of adrenaline dumping into a system that doesn't know yet whether it's fighting or fleeing. Mine were steady. Steady in a way that felt less like calm and more like a decision being made somewhere underneath my conscious mind, a switch flipping from daughter to something else. I looked at the note again under the dome light. Ask for Rebecca. I didn't know yet what a $142 passbook could possibly have to do with a senior bank manager, or why my grandmother would go to the trouble of hiding a name inside an account. Nobody had touched since before I could drive. I didn't know that in less than 48 hours, I'd be sitting across a desk from a woman who'd known my grandmother for 20 years, watching her pull a sealed folder out of a safety deposit box and say the sentence that would end my father's version of our family for good. All I knew, pulling out of that driveway, with the reception still going behind me, plates of potato salad and a trash can with my grandmother's handwriting still faintly visible, on a paper towel someone would throw away in an hour. All I knew was the arithmetic, 14 years of shifts nobody thanked me for, 2 Christmases missed to cover for coworkers with kids, a stepbrother who got a truck and a father who got relief, and a stepmother who got the last word, every single time, while I got a bank book in the trash and the word nurse used like an insult. I wasn't infrastructure to hold this family up anymore. I understood that now. With the same cold clarity I feel calling a code. I was done being weighed and found short. Grandma Evelyn had known that day was coming for a long time. She'd built for it. Now it was my turn to find out exactly what she'd built. First National Trust hadn't been First National Trust in almost 15 years. It had gone through 2 mergers and a rebrand, new signage, new carpet, a lobby that smelled like fresh paint, instead of the old ink and paper smell I remembered from childhood, when Grandma used to bring me here on Saturdays to deposit birthday checks into a savings account. She opened the week I was born, but the marble counter was the same. The brass rail along the teller windows was the same. And when I gave the woman at the front desk my name and said I was looking for Rebecca Hayes, her expression shifted in a way that told me Rebecca Hayes had been expecting me. I'm a nurse. I know what it looks like when someone's been briefed on a patient before they walk in the room. That particular blend of composed and careful, sympathy held at a professional distance, so it doesn't spill over into something unhelpful. Rebecca Hayes had that look the second. She came around the corner of her office, hand already extended, voice already pitched low and warm. Emma Carter. Not a question. I'm so sorry about your grandmother. Please, come in. Her office was small but immaculate, family photos angled just so on the credenza, a single potted orchid that had clearly been fussed over. She closed the door behind us with a soft click that felt, in that moment, louder than it should have. I have to admit, she said, sitting down across from me, folding her hands on the desk like she was about to deliver test results. I've been waiting for this appointment for 4 years. 4 years. Evelyn came in and set this up in person. Insisted on doing it herself. No phone calls. No emails. She said some things shouldn't leave a digital trail until they absolutely have to. Rebecca's mouth curved, not quite a smile, more like the specific fondness people reserve for someone who made their job interesting. She was very particular about the language. She made me repeat the instructions back to her twice. I set the faded blue passbook on the desk between us. My hands, I noticed, were steady again. That same clinical stillness from the reception had followed me here. Sat down in the chair with me, and I was grateful for it, because whatever was about to happen, I had a feeling I was going to need it. She told me, Rebecca continued, that if you ever came in here with this passbook and asked for me by name, it would mean one specific thing had happened, that your father had found out about the inheritance and reacted exactly the way she predicted he would. Something cold moved through my chest. She predicted the funeral. She predicted a great many things, Miss Carter. Your grandmother was, without question, the most thorough client I've had in 22 years at this branch. Rebecca opened a drawer, produced a manila folder with my name typed neatly on the tab, and slid it toward me, but kept 2 fingers resting on top of it, not quite letting go yet. Before I give you this, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, because everything that happens next depends on it. Okay. Did your father throw the passbook away? I didn't ask how she knew to ask. I just told her the truth. In the trash can by the kitchen island, in front of about 40 people. Rebecca nodded slowly, like a diagnosis had just been confirmed, and finally slid the folder the rest of the way across the desk. If you've ever had a stranger understand your family better than your own father does, comment she knew below. Because I promise you, it only gets stranger from here. Inside the folder was not a will. It wasn't even technically an inheritance document. Not yet. It was a letter, 4 pages, handwritten in Evelyn's small, careful librarian script, the kind of handwriting that came from decades of filling out index cards before anyone digitized a card catalog. I recognized it instantly. It was the same handwriting from every birthday card I'd ever gotten, the same handwriting on the note tucked in the back of the passbook, Emma. If you're reading this, it means Rebecca did exactly as I asked, and, I suspect, your father did exactly as I predicted. I'm sorry to say I planned for both. I want to tell you something I never said out loud while I was alive, because saying it out loud would have tipped my hand too early, and I needed your father to keep believing what he has always believed. That I died with nothing worth fighting over. I did not die with nothing. I stopped reading for a moment. My hands weren't shaking, but something in my throat had tightened. That particular ache that isn't quite tears, just the body bracing for something. It can already tell I was going to matter. The letter went on for 3 more pages, and I'm not going to pretend I absorbed all of it. On the first read, sitting in that small office with the orchid and the closed door. And Rebecca watching me with the patient, careful attention of someone who has delivered difficult news for a living. But I absorbed enough. enough to understand that this had never been about $142. The passbook itself was worthless. Evelyn said so herself, in writing, almost gleefully, like she was enjoying the joke even from beyond the grave. Its only function had ever been as a key. A physical object, boring enough that nobody would think twice about it, insignificant enough that my father would dismiss it exactly the way he'd dismissed me for 29 years, and specific enough that only someone who genuinely cared about what Evelyn actually wanted would bother to open it and read the 3 words tucked inside the back cover. Ask for Rebecca. It had been a test disguised as a gift, and my father had failed it in under 10 minutes, at his own mother's funeral, in front of 40 witnesses. The rest of the letter described what came next. A trust, funded years in advance, structured in a way Rebecca explained to me in plain terms. Once I'd finished, reading one clause at a time, watching my face carefully for signs I needed her to slow down, but threaded through the financial language was something else, something that made the back of my neck go cold. The second, I understood what I was actually looking at. Evelyn hadn't just been saving money, she'd been documenting. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from working 12-hour shifts in a trauma unit. The kind where your feet ache in a way that isn't about standing, but about absorbing hour after hour other people's worst days. I know that exhaustion intimately. What I felt driving home from the bank that afternoon was different. It wasn't tired, it was awake. That clean, cold, electric alertness that used to come over me in the middle of a code, when the panic drains away and everything narrows down to what needs to happen next. In order, without hesitation, Rebecca had given me copies of everything in the folder, with instructions to bring the originals to Olivia Bennett within the week. But she'd also given me something else, a name I hadn't expected. Not a beneficiary, a witness. Your grandmother, Rebecca had said, closing the folder gently, was very specific that certain financial records be preserved. Not destroyed, not summarized, not filed away and forgotten, preserved. She used that word 3 times in one meeting. I asked her why it mattered so much, and she told me, and I'm quoting her directly here, that some people only respect what they can't argue with. That night, in my apartment, I spread the copies across my kitchen table, the way I imagine a detective spreads case files. Except my case files smelled like they'd spent 4 years in a bank vault, and my only tools were a legal pad and a cup of coffee gone cold an hour ago. Bank statements going back further than I expected. Property records with Michael's name attached to transactions I'd never heard him mention at a single-family dinner. A ledger, handwritten in Evelyn's script, that read less like an accounting document and more like a diary. Dates, dollar amounts, and beside each one a short clipped note in her careful hand, March 1998. M. Borrowed $4,200 against my account for temporary business expenses. Never repaid. Told E. not to worry about it. October 2003. M. Listed my house with his agency without asking. Took the commission himself. I let it go. Didn't want to fight in front of the grandchildren. June 2011. M. attempted to have me sign updated power of attorney documents. Language was not what he described verbally. Consulted Olivia before signing anything. Page after page, year after year. My father, apparently, had been quietly borrowing against his own mother's finances for over 2 decades, dressing it up each time as a temporary favor, a misunderstanding, a family arrangement. Nobody needed to make a fuss about. And every single time Evelyn Carter, retired school librarian, quiet, thoughtful, never once raising her voice at a Thanksgiving table, had written it down, dated it, kept the receipts. Not out of spite. I understood that now, reading her handwriting late into the night, with my coffee gone cold and my chest gone tight. She hadn't been keeping score to punish him. She'd been keeping score in case, one day, someone needed proof that the story he told about himself wasn't the story that actually happened. If you've ever found out a family member had been quietly documenting years of betrayal because they knew one day someone would need the receipts, I want you in the comments. This is the part where the story stops being about grief and starts being about arithmetic. I didn't sleep much that week. 12-hour shifts don't leave a lot of room for grief or investigation, or whatever it was I was doing at 2 in the morning with a legal pad and a growing, methodical list of names. Olivia Bennett, estate attorney; Rebecca Hayes, senior bank manager; a private forensic accountant Olivia recommended, whose name I wrote down and circled twice. I went to work. I started IVs. I calmed down frightened families in waiting rooms. I did compressions on a 61-year-old man who didn't make it no matter how hard we worked, and I drove home every night to a kitchen table covered in 26 years of my father's quiet theft, carefully preserved by a woman who never once let him see her write it down. Tyler called twice that week. I let both calls go to voicemail. In the second one, his voice had lost some of its usual showroom polish. He sounded younger, almost uncertain, saying something about how Dad had been in a weird mood since the funeral, asking if I'd heard anything from Olivia. If there was anything going on with the estate that he should know about. I didn't call him back. Not yet. Evelyn's letter had been very specific about the order of operations, and I intended to follow it exactly. Because if there was one thing I'd learned about my grandmother in the 4 years, since she'd apparently started building this, quietly, patiently, one preserved document at a time, it was that she had never once made a move without knowing exactly what came next. I wasn't infrastructure anymore. I was executing a plan someone had trusted me to finish. And the ledger on my kitchen table wasn't finished yet. There were more names in it, more dates, more entries I hadn't gotten to, going back further than I expected, into years before I was even old enough to understand what my father did for a living, let alone what he'd been quietly taking. Somewhere in those pages, I was starting to understand, was the answer to a question I'd never quite let myself ask out loud, whether the man who called my job a fine little hobby had ever built anything of his own at all, or whether every single thing he had, the leased car, the second wife's boutique startup capital, the confidence to laugh at a $142 passbook in front of 40 mourners, had been quietly funded, one borrowed and never repaid dollar at a time, by the mother he'd just watched them lower into the ground. On the fourth night, I found the entry that made me set my coffee down and just sit there, staring at the kitchen wall for a long time. April 2015. M asked E to co-sign a loan for business expansion, told E it was a formality, that the bank required it but would never actually call on it. E co-signed. 6 months later, E discovered the loan had been used as a down payment on the lake property Michael now lists as his own investment asset. E never told Emma. Did not want to poison her relationship with her father before she was old enough to protect herself financially, the lake property. I knew the one. Michael talked about it at every holiday, like it was proof of his business acumen. His big score, the deal, that finally put him in a different tax bracket than the rest of us. He'd shown Tyler photos of it on his phone at Thanksgiving 2 years ago, bragging about the water frontage, joking that he'd leave it to whichever of his kids actually amounted to something. I remembered laughing along at the time because it was easier than sitting with what the joke actually meant. It had never been his down payment. It had been his mother's signature, obtained under a story that wasn't true, on a document she wouldn't have signed if she'd known what it actually said. And she'd known. For 11 years, she'd known. And she'd said nothing to me, because she was protecting a version of my childhood where I still got to believe my father was, at minimum, not a man who'd quietly used his own mother's credit to buy a lake house. He then bragged about it Thanksgiving. I photographed the page. I photographed all of them, every ledger entry, every bank statement, every property record, and I built a folder on my laptop labeled simply EC, her initials, nothing more, nothing that would mean anything to anyone who wasn't already inside this. Evelyn had spent 4 years being careful about digital trails. I intended to honor that same instinct, now that the folder was mine to protect. By the end of the week, the picture had stopped feeling like a shock and started feeling like a pattern. The way vitals on a monitor stop looking like random numbers, once you understand what they're trending toward. My father hadn't built an empire. He'd built a costume. Every year, a little more borrowed thread, a little more quietly forgiven debt, stitched together into a man who could stand at his own mother's funeral reception and call a $142 passbook worthless, without a flicker of shame, because shame requires understanding what you actually owe, and Michael Carter had never once, in 26 years of documented evidence, understood that. I called Olivia Bennett the next morning. She picked up on the second ring, like she'd been expecting the call for exactly as long as Rebecca had been expecting mine. "I take it," she said. "You've read the ledger. I have. Then I think it's time you and I talked about what your grandmother actually built, Emma. Because the trust is the easy part to explain. The rest of it is going to take a while." Olivia Bennett's office looked exactly like I imagined it would from her voice on the phone. Orderly, unhurried, the kind of room where nothing had ever been left to chance. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of case files, a wall of diplomas, and in the corner, a small side table with a single framed photo of her and my grandmother at what looked like a retirement party, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. I hadn't known they were that close. I was starting to understand that there was a great deal about my grandmother's life I hadn't known. "Your grandmother and I worked together for 11 years, Olivia said, sliding a thicker folder across her desk than the one Rebecca had given me. This one bound, tabbed, organized with the precision of someone who'd had 4 years to get it right. Not just on this, on everything. She came to me the first time your father asked her to co-sign that loan for the lake property. She wanted to know exactly what she was signing before he ever put a pen in her hand. She let him think she didn't understand it. She let everyone think a great many things, Emma. That was rather the point." Olivia opened the folder to the first tab. "What I need you to understand before we go any further is that this was never designed as revenge. Your grandmother was explicit about that in writing. More than once, she built a record, a true one. What happens with that record, legally, publicly, within your family, was always going to be your decision, not hers. She trusted you to make it, once you had all the facts. That's the whole reason this exists." I nodded. Though something in my chest had gone tight again, that same clinical stillness settling over me, the way it does in the first 90 seconds of a code, before training takes over, and your hands just start moving. "Show me the rest," I said. Olivia paused before turning to the next tab, studying me for a moment the way I imagined she'd studied Evelyn across this same desk 100 times before. "Before I do, I want to say something, Emma, and then I won't say it again. Your grandmother never once asked me to help her punish your father. Every conversation we ever had about this record started the same way. She'd say, 'I just want the truth written down somewhere he can't argue with it.' That's all. She wasn't interested in his suffering. She was interested in the truth existing permanently, whether or not anyone ever chose to use it. But she built the whole mechanism for using it. The passbook, the letter, the order of operations. She did." Olivia folded her hands. "Because she also understood her son. She knew that if she left you a simple inheritance with no context, he would find a way to contest it, minimize it, or talk you out of taking it entirely, the way he's talked you out of things your whole life. The mechanism wasn't built for revenge. It was built so that the truth would survive contact with Michael Carter. That's a very different kind of construction." I thought about that for a long moment. The distinction between building something to hurt someone and building something sturdy enough to survive them. It was, I realized, exactly the kind of distinction my grandmother would have cared about, down to the letter. We went through it methodically, the way I imagined she would have gone through it with Evelyn herself. Years ago, one document at a time, the lake property loan. 3 additional instances of Michael listing properties that weren't legally his to list, and pocketing commissions that should have gone to Evelyn's estate. A power of attorney document from 2011 that Michael had tried to push through with language subtly different from what he'd described out loud. Language that would have given him full financial control over Evelyn's remaining assets. Effective immediately. No medical incapacity required. Evelyn had caught it. Olivia had drafted the real version herself, the one Evelyn actually signed, specifically worded to prevent exactly that kind of maneuver from ever working again. She was sharper than anyone gave her credit for, Olivia said, watching me absorb it. "Including you, I suspect. She was a school librarian for 31 years. My voice came out flatter than I meant it to. I thought that meant patient. I didn't think it meant strategic. In my experience, it's rarely one or the other." Olivia turned to the last tab in the folder, and her expression shifted into something more careful. "This is the part I need you to prepare yourself for. Not because it's more damning than what you've already seen. Because it isn't about money at all. She slid a single sheet across the desk. It was a photocopy of a handwritten note. Not Evelyn's handwriting this time. Sharper, more hurried, dated 8 years ago. Mom, don't make this a whole thing. Emma doesn't need to know every detail of how the family finances work. She's got enough going on with nursing school. Just sign where I marked and we'll sort out the details later. 8 years ago. I'd been in the middle of my clinical rotations, exhausted in a way I hadn't known a person could be exhausted and still function, surviving on hospital cafeteria coffee and 4 hours of sleep a night. I remembered calling Grandma Evelyn during that stretch, crying on the phone about a med-surg exam. I was sure I'd failed, and I remembered her telling me, calm as anything, that I would be fine, that she believed in me completely, that I should focus only on the exam and let the rest of the world sort itself out for a week. She'd been sorting out a fraudulent power of attorney. Attempt the same week she was talking me off a ledge about a nursing exam. And at no point, not once, had she let either crisis bleed into the other. She'd protected my one clear shot at a career from her son's financial games, quietly, without asking for a single ounce of credit. If you've ever found out someone was protecting you from a crisis while you were too exhausted to notice, while you thought you were the only one struggling that week, I need you in the comments. This is where the story stops being sad and starts being something else entirely. I drove home from Olivia's office and didn't turn the radio on. I didn't call anyone. I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen, where I'd spread out 4 years of financial betrayal across a legal pad just days earlier. And I did something I hadn't let myself do since the moment I found her in her reading chair. I let myself actually feel it. Not the grief, which had been sitting in my chest since the moment I checked for a pulse that wasn't there, but the other thing underneath it. The thing I'd been too busy investigating, too busy being useful and methodical and clinical to sit with. I had spent 29 years trying to be enough for a family that had already decided, long before I was born into it, exactly how much space I was allowed to take up. I was the nurse, useful in an emergency, easy to call when someone needed a ride to urgent care or an opinion on a weird rash. Invisible the rest of the time. Tyler got the truck because Tyler was easy to love in the specific, uncomplicated way my father understood love. Loud, visible, easily flattered. I got a bank book in a trash can because loving me correctly would have required my father to sit with the fact that I'd built something. A career, a life, a version of myself, entirely without his help, and admitting that would have meant admitting what kind of father he actually was. Evelyn had understood all of it, every year of it. And instead of trying to fix my father, or force some deathbed reconciliation where everyone cried and pretended the last 4 decades hadn't happened the way they'd happened, she'd done something quieter, and, I was starting to realize, considerably more effective. She'd simply stopped waiting for him to change and started building an exit for me instead. That was the moment the arithmetic finished itself in my head, clean and total. The way a diagnosis clicks into place, once you finally have every piece of the lab work back. I was not, and had never been, a daughter to Michael Carter in any sense he understood the word. I was infrastructure, a person who showed up, absorbed what needed absorbing, filled the gaps he left in every version of the family. He curated for other people's benefit. Karen got the wine and the compliments. Tyler got the truck and the pride. I got called in when something needed fixing and dismissed the second it was fixed, over and over, for 29 years, and I had spent almost all of that time trying to earn a kind of validation that was never, structurally, ever going to be handed to me. Because the entire architecture of that family had been built without a column for me in it at all. I wasn't angry, sitting there at 2 a.m. with cold coffee and a folder of evidence on my kitchen table. Anger would have felt almost comforting at that point. Familiar, hot. Something I could burn through in a single furious night and wake up lighter. What I felt instead was colder than that, clearer. The specific, terrible calm of finally understanding something I should have understood years ago. And realizing that understanding it changed absolutely nothing about what had already happened to me, but changed everything about what I was willing to let happen next. I stopped waiting for my father to notice me. I started, instead, calculating exactly what it was going to cost him that he never had. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes from working codes for a living. You learn, fairly early on, that the body doesn't care about your feelings while it's failing. It doesn't pause for grief or shock, or the specific horror of realizing someone you love isn't going to make it. It just keeps failing, methodically, system by system, until you either intervene correctly or you don't. I had spent 6 years learning to set my feelings aside, long enough to act, and to let them back in only once the immediate crisis had passed. Sitting at that kitchen table, I understood I'd been doing the exact same thing with my family for 29 years, except nobody had ever told me the crisis had an endpoint. I kept intervening, kept showing up, kept absorbing, kept telling myself that if I just did it well enough, for long enough, someone would eventually notice that the patient, the family, my father's approval, whatever I'd been trying to save, was worth saving in the first place. Evelyn's ledger told me, in her own careful handwriting, dated and specific, that the diagnosis had been clear for at least 26 years. I simply hadn't been the one holding the chart. Tyler called again. The next morning, and this time I picked up. His voice had that same uncertain edge from his voicemail. Sharper now, less showroom polished. "Emma, what's going on? Dad's been weird all week. He keeps asking if I've heard from you, if I know what Grandma's lawyer said. Karen thinks you're hiding something." "Karen's not wrong," I said. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I could hear the dealership's overhead radio playing faintly behind him. "Is it bad?" I thought about the ledger, the lake property. The note that told Evelyn not to bother, explaining the details to her exhausted nursing student granddaughter. I thought about 40 people. Watching my father throw away the only physical object my grandmother had trusted me with, and laughing while he did it. "It's not bad," I said finally. "It's just true. You'll understand soon enough. Everyone will." I hung up before he could ask anything else, and for a moment I just sat there with the phone, still warm in my hand, thinking about Tyler in a way I hadn't let myself think about him before. He wasn't Michael. Not really. He was spoiled, and a little oblivious, and he'd absolutely benefited from being the easy child in a family that only had room for one difficult truth at a time. But he'd also never once, in 27 years, done anything as calculated as what the ledger showed our father doing for 2.5 decades. There was a version of this where Tyler ended up collateral damage simply for being convenient to blame. And some old, tired part of me wanted to protect him from that, the way I'd once wanted to protect all of them. I set that thought aside. Evelyn hadn't built this ledger to protect the people who were comfortable. She'd built it to protect the truth, and if Tyler wanted protecting, he was going to have to earn it the same way I had, by choosing, once the truth was in front of him, what kind of person he intended to be about it. My hands, resting flat on the kitchen table, next to a folder with my initials on it, were completely, perfectly still. Olivia called me back into her office 2 days later, and this time she didn't open with pleasantries. She had a single page in front of her, printed, not photocopied. Something new, something she'd been sitting on until she was sure I could handle the rest of it. "There's one more piece," she said. "Your grandmother left instructions for how she wanted this to actually unfold. Not just the evidence the moment. She was specific that it happened somewhere. Your father couldn't control the room. Somewhere with witnesses. He respects more than he respects family, because those are the witnesses that have ever made him behave." "The reading of the will," I said slowly, understanding arriving the way it always did lately, quiet, complete, a piece of lab work finally coming back. "The reading of the will," Olivia agreed, with extended family present, with Rebecca present, in her professional capacity, and with one more piece of evidence I haven't shown you yet, because your grandmother wanted you to see it last, once you already understood everything else. She slid the final page across the desk. "Tyler filmed something at a family barbecue 2 summers ago. He doesn't know what's on it. Your grandmother did." I picked up the page and read it once, then again, and felt the last piece of the arithmetic lock into place. I wasn't infrastructure anymore. I was finally the one holding the ledger. The reading of the will took place 3 weeks later, in a conference room, Olivia's firm normally reserved for depositions. Long table, water glasses lined up like place settings, a screen mounted on the far wall that nobody in my family had thought to ask about in advance. Olivia had invited exactly the people Evelyn's instructions specified. My father, Karen, Tyler, two of Evelyn's siblings who'd flown in from out of state, a cousin who'd been close to her, and, at the end of the table, in a gray suit that made her look considerably more formal than she had in her cluttered little bank office, Rebecca Hayes. My father clocked her the second he walked in and didn't bother hiding his confusion. "Why is the bank here?" "Rebecca will be relevant shortly," Olivia said in the same even, unhurried tone she used for everything. "Please sit." He sat. Karen sat beside him, already scanning the room, the way she scanned a boutique for shoplifters. And Tyler took the chair across from me, giving me a small, uncertain nod that I didn't quite return. Olivia began the way these things always begin, I imagine. The formal language, the reading of Evelyn Carter's identity and residence, and the date of the document's execution. My father's leg was bouncing under the table within the first 2 minutes. He'd expected this part to be quick. He'd expected, I understood now, to walk out of this room within the hour, having confirmed what he'd told everyone at the funeral. That his mother had died with next to nothing, and whatever there was would be split in some sensible, forgettable way. Evelyn's siblings sat quietly at the far end of the table, exchanging a glance I couldn't quite read. Not surprise. Exactly. More like the particular recognition of people who'd known their sister a long time and had learned, decades ago, never to underestimate the quiet ones in the family. The cousin beside them kept glancing his suit at Olivia's tabbed folder, at the mounted screen on the wall, doing the same math I imagine everyone in that room was doing, whatever this reading turned out to be. It clearly wasn't going to be the quick, forgettable formality my father had promised them on the drive over. The bulk of Evelyn Carter's estate, Olivia read, including all liquid assets, investment holdings, and the entirety of the Carter Family Trust, established in 2022, is bequeathed in full to her granddaughter, Emma Carter. The room went very quiet, in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when a number is about to become the only thing anyone can think about. That's not possible. My father's voice had lost its usual real estate warmth. My mother didn't have a trust. She had a savings account with $140 in it. I saw the passbook myself. "You did," Olivia agreed. "You saw it at the reception, and you threw it in the trash in front of 40 witnesses, which is, incidentally, documented." She didn't look up from her folder. "The passbook was never meant to hold value on its own, Michael. It was a key. Your mother built a confidential trust 4 years ago, funded through assets she managed privately and never disclosed to you, specifically because she anticipated, correctly as it turns out, that you would attempt to interfere with any inheritance you knew about in advance. If you've ever watched someone's whole understanding of their own family fall apart in real time, in a single sentence, stay with me. Because this is only the first of 7 things that room learned that afternoon. Karen recovered first, in the way she always recovered first, with an edge sharpened for exactly this kind of moment. This is absurd. Evelyn barely had 2 nickels to rub together. Where would a retired librarian even get money to fund a trust? Nobody knew about that, Rebecca said, speaking for the first time since she'd sat down, is where I come in. She opened a folder of her own, thinner than Olivia's, but somehow more devastating for it, because everything inside it had my father's name on it instead of Evelyn's. Over the past several weeks, at Miss Carter's request, she nodded toward me, and under proper legal authorization from the estate's executor, I compiled a full record of financial transactions between Evelyn Carter and her son, Michael, spanning the last 26 years. My father's face had gone the particular shade of pale I recognize from patients right before they either faint or start shouting. He chose shouting. "This is a setup. This is, Olivia, what is this? Some kind of ambush? I'm not sitting here while my dead mother's bank records get paraded in front of my aunt and uncle like I'm on trial." "You're not on trial, Michael," Olivia said, calm as ever. "You're at the reading of your mother's will, which she structured specifically to include this documentation, because she anticipated you would call it a setup, rather than acknowledge it as fact. I'd encourage you to let Rebecca finish. The alternative is that we finish without you in the room, and I don't think that serves you better." He sat back down. His jaw had that tight working look I remembered from childhood, right before he'd raise his voice about something, and then insist later that he hadn't raised his voice at all. Rebecca went through it the same way she'd walked me through it weeks earlier. Methodical, unemotional, letting the dates and dollar amounts do the work. She didn't need to editorialize. The 1998 loan never repaid. The 2003 commission taken from a house that wasn't his to sell. The 2011 power of attorney attempt caught and blocked before it ever took effect. And finally, the lake property, the down payment that had never been Michael's own money at all, but his mother's signature, obtained under a story that bore no resemblance to what the loan documents actually said. You told her it was a formality, I said. And it was the first time I'd spoken since the reading began. That the bank would never actually call on it. She co-signed because she trusted you. You used that trust to buy a lake house you've spent 6 years bragging about at every holiday dinner like you built it yourself. Emma. My father's voice had shifted, the same wounded, aggrieved tone he used whenever a listing fell through and he needed someone else to have caused it. You don't understand the whole situation. Your grandmother and I had an arrangement. She wrote down every part of the arrangement, Dad, in her own handwriting, dated. I've read all of it. I kept my voice level, the same flat, clinical calm I use when I'm telling a family in a waiting room something they don't want to hear, because I know that calm travels further than anger ever does, and it can't be dismissed as an overreaction. She protected me from finding out about most of it while I was in nursing school, because she didn't want it to break something in me before I was steady enough to survive knowing. She let you keep thinking. She didn't understand what you were doing. The whole time, she understood exactly what you were doing. If you've ever had to sit across a table from someone and calmly recite years of receipts while they insisted you didn't understand the whole situation, drop a comment. I promise you, we understood. We'd just been quiet about it for longer than they deserved. Tyler had been silent through most of it, staring at the table. His usual easy confidence entirely gone. When Olivia turned to the final tab in her folder, he looked up with something close to dread. There's one more piece of evidence your grandmother wanted included, Olivia said, and I want to be clear that it was recorded without any awareness on Tyler's part of what it would eventually be used for. She nodded toward the screen on the wall, and an assistant I hadn't noticed pressed a button on a laptop. The footage was shaky, clearly filmed on a phone, dated 2 summers ago at what looked like a family barbecue. Tyler's voice, off camera, narrating something about the grill. And then, in the background, unmistakably, my father and Karen at a patio table. Karen's voice carrying the way it always did when she thought no one important was listening. She's not getting a dime more than she has to. Your mother's practically already forgotten her anyway. Once the house sells, we're fine. And Emma can keep playing nurse. She was never going to amount to anything more than that. The clip ran 12 seconds. Nobody in the room said anything for a long moment after it ended. Tyler's face had gone white. I didn't know I recorded that. I was filming the grill, I swear. I didn't even know that was. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. Whatever else Tyler was, he'd never been the architect of anything in this family. He'd been raised inside a story someone else built for him, the same as I had, just with a different set of furniture in his half of the house. My father, for the first time since the reading began, didn't have anything to say at all. Olivia let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to, and then she closed the folder in front of her with a soft final click. Evelyn Carter's estate, per the terms of the trust, transfers in full to Emma Carter, effective immediately. This includes the primary residence, all investment accounts, and the entirety of the Carter family trust. Michael Carter and Karen Carter are named in the will, only insofar as Evelyn explicitly requests they receive nothing further, given the extensive documentation of financial harm already recovered through prior legal remedy during her lifetime. Olivia looked up, and for the first time her voice softened, just slightly, aimed less at the room and more at me. She also left a letter she asked me to read last, addressed directly to Emma. I hadn't known there was a second letter. I felt my throat tighten, in the same way it had in Rebecca's office apps weeks earlier. That ache that isn't quite tears, but is close enough to it that I had to breathe carefully to keep my voice steady. Olivia read it aloud, and I'll remember every word of it for the rest of my life, Emma. If you're hearing this, it means everything went the way I hoped it would, and probably some of the way I feared it would, too. I want you to know that none of this was ever about punishing your father. I loved him in the complicated, exhausted way. You love a child who never quite grew into the person you hoped he'd become. But loving him never once required me to let him take from you what he'd already taken from me. You were never infrastructure, Emma. You were the only person in this family who ever showed up without calculating what it would cost you. I saw that every single year, even when you thought no one was watching closely enough to notice. Take the house, take the trust. Take whatever peace you can find in knowing the truth. Finally has somewhere permanent to live. But don't let this money turn into the same kind of weapon it became for your father. Build something with it instead. That's the only inheritance that ever really mattered to me. Not what I left out you, but what you choose to become with it. Asterisk. I love you. I always did the math on that one too, and it never once came out close. I didn't say anything else in that conference room. There wasn't anything left that needed saying. My father sat there with his jaw working silently, Karen's face frozen in an expression. I didn't have the energy to interpret, and Tyler looked at me with something that might, eventually, given enough time and enough honesty, turn into an actual apology. I stood up, gathered the folder with my initials on it, and walked out of the room without looking back. Not out of anger, not even out of triumph, but because I finally understood that I didn't need anything else from that table. Everything I actually needed had already been given to me, 4 years ago, by a woman who spent her quiet retirement building a truth, sturdy enough to survive her own son. The hallway outside Olivia's conference room had a window overlooking the parking lot, and I stood there for a few minutes before I trusted myself to drive. Watching afternoon light move across the asphalt, letting the last of the adrenaline drain out of my system, the way it does after a long shift, slow and uneven, leaving me steadier than I'd felt in weeks. Rebecca found me there before I left. She didn't say much, just squeezed my shoulder once, told me Evelyn would have been proud of how I'd carried it, and reminded me that the trust paperwork would need my signature within the week. Then she left me to the quiet, the same way my grandmother, I suspected, would have wanted someone to. 6 months later, I used part of the trust to fund a scholarship at the community college's nursing program, named for a retired school librarian who never once, in 31 years, let a single overdue book or a single family lie go unaccounted for. I still work my shifts. I still start IVs and calm down frightened families and do compressions on patients who don't always make it. But I go home now to a house that was never thrown away, to a version of my family's story that finally belongs to the person who was actually there for all of it. My father called, eventually. I let it go to voicemail, the same way he'd let so many of my calls go unanswered for so many years. Some debts, I've learned, don't need to be repaid to be settled. They just need, finally, to be written down correctly, by someone who was paying attention the whole time. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments what your own arithmetic moment looked like. The day you finally stopped waiting to be seen and started building something of your own instead. I read every single one.